Breaking sitrep from the Pokrovsk perimeter. In just one intense clash, we watched multiple Russian armored vehicles get forced to a dead stop in the open, trapped between thin tree lines and dirt tracks. Armor took hits, others got pinned, and once their momentum died, the entire sector morphed from a standard front line into an absolute kill box. Tactically, that alone is a massive development. But what makes this specific engagement escalate is something far more lethal. Ukrainian commanders shoved an M1A1 Abrams straight into that exposed grid right where recon drones, FPV swarms, and dialed-in artillery were already punishing the zone. In a battlespace where Overwatch sees every single twitch, deploying heavy armor is a massive, calculated gamble. If that Abrams parked for even a minute, it gets dialed in and vaporized. If Ukrainian dismounts pushed across the open without suppressing fire, the entire assault collapses in minutes. But if this offensive held together, it exposes a massive operational shift, way beyond one single tank. It proves Kyiv is fusing heavy armor, combat drones, artillery, and infantry into a single synchronized kill chain, not isolated assets. Stick with me here. We are about to unpack how Russian defensive lines totally lost cohesion, and why this specific battle signals a monumental evolution in modern ground combat. So, commanders must ask this critical question. In such heavily exposed terrain, why order an Abrams to advance? And what tactical groundwork was laid to turn a seemingly reckless push into a highly calculated strike? The initial operation near Pokrovsk wasn't an armor assault at all. We watched Ukrainian forces map the exact rhythm of the Russian defensive posture before attempting to shatter it. This is vital intelligence, because the Pokrovsk perimeter isn't where this hostile movement actually started. The mechanized convoy pushed out from a staging sector deep inside the city ruins, giving Ukrainian strike teams a completely different tactical headache. The suburban buffer zone ahead offered nothing but sparse tree lines, dirt trails, shallow trenches, and wide open ground. Meaning, the second those armored transports left urban cover and advanced, their vector became highly predictable to aerial overwatch, even if their final dug-in strongpoints remained totally invisible to forward infantry. That exact dynamic makes this grid incredibly lethal, yet absolutely critical for both sides. Recon units weren't just hunting for concealed firing nests along the tree line. They were continuously tracking exactly how the Russian armor column bled out of the city limits, analyzing which corridor it took, where it bogged down, and exactly where splinter elements diverted toward tree belts and roadside defilades for cover. An armored column transitioning from concrete structures into raw, exposed terrain simply cannot hide from optics. But they could still shatter into smaller dispersed fire teams targets that become incredibly hard to eliminate if they secure fighting positions fast enough. Recon drones at high altitudes monitored the macro battlespace and approach vectors, while FPV kamikazes loitered over the most critical choke points. Dialing in on the tree belt perimeters, temporary staging halts along dirt paths, and the exact coordinates where logistics and infantry elements were likely deploying in squads. Ukrainian Tactical Command knew that pushing infantry forward blindly would just feed the meat grinder. Assault teams advancing across open terrain without hard intel on the defensive lines would get suppressed and pinned before the real offensive even materialized. This is exactly where the fierce tactical chess match truly started, because the Russian armored column refused to stick to a predictable formation as it exited the urban perimeter into the open zone. Certain transports maintained a stretched column along the primary dirt corridors to preserve momentum and heading, while other elements fractured off into smaller detachments, rushing tree lines and roadside berms to avoid forming one massive, juicy target. This tactic created a fluid formation, where forward advance and rapid dispersion occurred simultaneously, making the battlefield chaotic for ground troops to read, but highly targetable for aerial overwatch. Strike Command responded by tracking the evolution of that movement instead of hunting isolated vehicles. An armor column stalling at a crossroad, a mechanized squad fracturing off way too early, or an element bunching up tight for far too long. These were all massive indicators telegraphing exactly where the combat pressure would spike next. Every single maneuver by that hostile convoy broadcasted their intent. Every pause or pivot exposed a fresh tactical vulnerability that our optics tracked and painted. This shifted the entire opening phase into a high-stakes war of timing, abandoning traditional contact searches. Russian units were desperately balancing rapid assault speeds with wide dispersion, fighting to reach the engagement line before getting dialed in and neutralized. While Ukrainian strike teams calculated the exact second that delicate balance would shatter, and when that column would fully commit. Let's analyze what happened next. Listen up. You and I are watching the exact second these vehicles leave the road for the tree lines. Movement just became brutal commitment. No major detonations yet, but the grim architecture of this impending firefight was already locking into place. Both combat elements kept eyes glued to that contested asphalt, knowing exactly where the first lethal kinetic strikes would actually land, and where total control of the battle space could violently pivot. Once Ukrainian forces got solid drone intel on Russian maneuvers, they did not rush head-on. Instead, they launched a calculated, long-range operation to shatter the enemy formation. That tactical shift began with ruthless target selection. Ukrainian combat commanders zeroed in on the critical logistical nodes keeping the enemy offensive alive. We are talking rear echelon armor, freshly halted troop transports, and exposed infantry squads gearing up to cross open terrain, all instantly became high-value targets right at their most vulnerable phase. This is exactly where those combat drones turned the tide. One precision hit on a lead transport could bottleneck the advance, force trailing units to scatter, and trigger absolute chaos down the entire supply corridor, heading toward the wood line. Heavy artillery then hammered down a second layer of hell. Rather than wasting shells across massive grids, Ukrainian howitzers specifically pounded those tight staging zones behind the tree cover, right where Russian tanks and heavy armor sat clustered together. This is crucial, because these were not random artillery shells falling across the map. The incoming fire intentionally forced Russian assault elements to eat dirt, scatter wide, or stall their timeline. And every single minute of delay brutally severed the link between the frontline elements and the backup forces still desperately trying to push up from the rear. The entire battle space began fracturing right at its weakest joints. A Russian combat formation that looked lethal and agile was suddenly taking massive, coordinated pressure across multiple sectors simultaneously. This meant the enemy could still maneuver in fractured pockets, but their cohesive, unified combat rhythm was completely destroyed. Multiple Russian battle tanks and armored carriers took heavy damage right alongside a narrow dirt track hugging the forest edge. Those burning wrecks instantly choked off the exact same supply corridor that the rear echelons needed to maintain a functional, organized forward assault. Enemy infantry scrambled to clear that deadly roadblock fast. Drivers desperately tried creeping around the smoking armor to pry the route open, because losing that single dirt choke point meant the critical supply chain would snap under heavy fire. Ukrainian reconnaissance spotted this desperate maneuver almost the second it happened. Attack drone operators immediately locked onto movement around the barricade. The next kinetic strike did not just shred more steel on the dirt, it permanently sealed that critical access route. The threat escalated from one disabled tank to a completely choked military artery. That blocked corridor could no longer sustain the frontline forces with any reliable reinforcement. That tactical strangulation altered the battle flow way more than any massive, flashy explosion ever could. Now, the leading Russian assault teams were stranded in the kill zone, while rear units were completely gridlocked, totally unable to plug the gaping holes in their front line. What followed was not instant collapse, but slow, brutal tactical distortion. The leading combat clusters were still alive, but they grew violently isolated with every ticking second. Rear elements were fully armed and lethal, but heavy suppression pinned them way farther back than planned, freezing them in total hesitation rather than aggressive action. The squads trapped right between the woods and the open kill zone faced an absolute tactical nightmare. They could not retreat, but they could not push forward either, sitting there under intense fire, paralyzed without the freedom to maneuver or reset. This specific combat phase was an absolute turning point. Ukraine was not chasing explosions for high kill counts. The deeper tactical win meant violently shattering the enemy's sequence. And when that sequence breaks, the entire hostile formation starts crumbling and losing shape long before the last men and machines are wiped out. Stick with me. The actual question is not just how many vehicles ended up burning. We have to ask ourselves, does modern warfare reward the military that bags the most kills, or the force that violently rips the enemy's operational system apart until it stops functioning as a single unit. Only when the Russian formation was completely knocked off balance did Ukrainian commanders finally unleash their heavy armored assault elements, and that single command signaled the brutal kickoff of the true assault phase. The battle space had already been brutally shaped from above and from a distance, so the follow-up was not some blind suicide charge. It was a perfectly timed thrust, designed to exploit the chaos already paralyzing the enemy. This is where full combined arms warfare clicked. Recon drones kept feeding live, real-time tracking data straight down to the shooters. Artillery batteries stayed hot, ready to strike within mere seconds. Mechanized infantry pushed toward the zero line, keeping wide dispersion to avoid becoming one massive, easy target for artillery. Then, the Abrams rolled out. No hiding, no waiting behind berms. Command sent it into the open because this armor's mission relied heavily on drawing all enemy eyes, just as much as its main gun. Let's watch this critical breaking point together. 60 tons of heavy American armor crossing open terrain forces a rapid tactical choice. The Russian defenders simply could not afford to ignore it. The enemy reaction was instant. Concealed Russian firing positions that had been dead silent suddenly lit up. But those frantic enemy responses provided the exact radar signals Ukrainian commanders had been hunting since the assault began. Muzzle flashes erupted across the tree lines. Thermal optics immediately picked up shifting crew heat signatures. Previously disciplined, concealed enemy movement suddenly turned into chaotic, wide-open scrambling. All that fresh intel streamed straight to command. Ukrainian drone operators logged every single thermal spike and relayed the coordinates. This fed Ukrainian artillery exactly what they needed. No blind firing, just a systematic, sequenced kill chain. Suddenly, the tactical pressure flipped. Russian forces actually thought they were neutralizing a massive, visible, armored threat. In reality, every single anti-tank missile fired at that, Abrams just handed over their exact trench coordinates to Ukrainian spotters. The more the enemy fixated on that armor, the more they compromised their entire defensive perimeter. An invisible, scattered trench network suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree, forming a clear tactical map that could be systematically dismantled. But understand this, the Abrams was not just rolling unopposed. The driver had to keep the tracks churning. Stopping dead for even 5 seconds would hand enemy artillery crews or kamikaze drone pilots the exact firing solution they desperately needed. Talk about a razor-thin margin for error. The crew had to push slow enough to actively bait the incoming fire, yet fast enough to stay alive on a brutal front line where one static second means sudden, fiery death. That deadly balance dictated this whole operation. The Abrams wasn't spearheading a classic cavalry charge, it was violently ripping the mask off the enemy defense. This tactic turned the tank into a massive bullet magnet, but the real killing power sat elsewhere. Right behind it, Ukrainian assault units were shifting. Bradleys pushed into superior firing spots. Artillery units locked onto live drone feeds, with the entire strike package ready to drop hell on new targets. For the Russians, the battlefield math was getting brutal. Striking the tank seemed absolutely mandatory, but pulling that trigger practically guaranteed an explosive counter-battery strike right back at them. So you and I have to ask, did the Abrams just rack up kills with its main gun? No. The real tactical question is, if this armor acted as a genuine breakthrough weapon, or as a highly calculated tripwire designed to force the Russians out of hiding so the broader strike force could engage. The second those Russian trenches blew their cover, the entire operation escalated from baiting to butchering. This is exactly where the heavy armor started dominating the zone. The gunner wasn't just spraying high-explosive rounds blindly into the woods. Every single 120mm shell slammed into confirmed targets, obliterating enemy infantry squads hiding behind shallow dirt mounds. They ripped apart fire teams dug into the woodline, and they completely shattered enemy vehicles parked in hasty defensive spots along the main approach. If those Russian guns had stayed hot, advancing Ukrainian infantry would have been absolutely shredded in the open. But with those positions flattened, assault teams could push through the kill zone with significantly lower casualties. The brutal logic of the assault sequence was finally paying off. The big gun fired. The shockwave pinned the surviving defenders down, and that split second of pure chaos cracked open a window for the assault squads to advance. However, command didn't just throw massive waves of troops forward. Fire teams pushed up in violent short bounds, crawling through ditches. They used shattered tree lines and craters to stay off the radar while eating up ground. Combat feeds show it was all about precise timing, not blind speed. Push up too early, and they'd march right into a meat grinder. Hesitate and move too late, the armor's suppression window slams shut, letting the Russian lines reload and re-engage. Up above, kamikaze drones maintained relentless pressure. They ruthlessly hunted down any Russian troops trying to flank, fall back into the deep woods, or mass up for a sudden counterattack. That meant the kill zone never actually cooled down. If there's one thing you and I must take from this, even after taking a direct hit, surviving Russians couldn't run. The same sky that exposed them was still hunting their every step. Alright, let's break down today's tactical footage. Russian infantry scrambled along the tree lines, desperately trying to form a defensive wall against the Ukrainian advance. But those efforts failed fast. The second those troops moved, Ukrainian attack drones were already hovering, ready to drop payloads. These strikes didn't need to wipe out entire units to be absolutely devastating. A single, well-timed hit forced hostile troops to scatter, shattering their tactical spacing and destroying any chance of a stable defense under heavy fire. As the bombardment dragged on, the entire Russian formation began cracking. Isolated pockets could still fire back, but zero coordinated support existed between these fragmented squads on the battlefield. That reality bled the defensive line dry with every passing minute, even with scattered guns firing. For Ukrainian assault elements, this was the exact moment battlefield control violently shifted hands. Assault infantry pushed deep into the cleared sectors, locking down the trench networks they had just ripped open, and brutally expanding their foothold step by step, refusing to overextend their supply lines. Meanwhile, American-made Abrams tanks laid down heavy fire from the front, avoiding reckless charges, instead anchoring themselves where their main guns could instantly eliminate any newly exposed enemy armor or strongholds. Its lethal presence guaranteed that any Russian attempt to dig in met high explosive fury. This is where the armor's true combat role shined. The tank wasn't deployed to replace ground troops or to capture contested territory completely solo, but to obliterate specific hard targets that made crossing the kill zone a death sentence. Once neutralized, the entire tactical picture flipped. A fiercely contested death trap rapidly transformed into a secured assault corridor, and that vaunted defensive line bled out, losing its structural ability to hold ground. Listen closely, the main takeaway from this kinetic phase isn't about one lucky strike or a single push. It is a masterclass in how devastating firepower, rapid movement, and drone observation violently turn a hostile kill zone into a secured route. And we see firsthand how this brutal operation relies on split-second timing over sheer mass. The firefight didn't stop once Ukrainian troops breached the line. The deadliest phase was actively preventing Russian commanders from deploying rapid reinforcements to turn that hard-won ground back into a massive meat grinder. In unforgiving terrain, like the outer sectors of Pokrovsk, a captured trench is never truly safe. A heavily armed reserve force crashing the line at the exact right second will instantly drag both armies back into a vicious, bloody cycle of close-quarters combat. That is exactly why Ukrainian commanders refused to treat the captured dirt as a victory lap. The operational focus violently shifted from shattering the frontline trenches to ruthlessly hunting down any organized counterattack forming in the rear. Lethal FPV kamikaze drones pushed deep into hostile airspace, hunting behind the burning enemy positions. Their combat mission was no longer strictly about laying down suppressive cover for the infantry, but to actively stalk the critical operational signatures that emerge when a broken defense scrambles to patch its bleeding lines. And on the live feeds, those tactical patterns were glaringly obvious to seasoned drone operators. Enemy squads clustering near concrete, infantry inspecting burned-out armor to use as makeshift blast shields. We even tracked hostile units rerouting their approach vectors, desperately trying to flank the choked supply roads and hit the active front from blind spots. Ukrainian gunners answered those maneuvers with surgical precision instead of blind volume. Drone swarms and heavy guns weren't wasted on empty fields. The objective was to vaporize the exact staging zones where Russian troops were assembling for a kinetic counteroffensive, That meant dropping ordnance directly on troop clusters attempting to reform, hammering logistics vehicles that dared to shift into alternative flanking lanes, and ruthlessly terminating any push to clear the supply corridor that had been systematically choked out earlier today. Every single barrage was calculated to keep Russian commanders trapped in a reactive panic, completely killing their forward momentum. The massive Abrams tank also evolved its tactical role here. It became an immovable steel anchor, pinning the enemy down and stripping Russian infantry of the morale needed to sprint across open terrain. Its heavy cannon mattered. The second a new hostile firing position exposed itself, it risked immediate, catastrophic annihilation. As long as that heavy armor held the main battle axis with rounds in the chamber, Russian forces knew any naked sprint to reclaim dirt would be violently punished before starting. That threw an iron ceiling over their operational capabilities. Launching a coherent counterattack is basically impossible when your front line is eating tank shells and your rear logistics are being live-streamed by hunter drones. At the exact same time, what you and I are watching is textbook discipline. Ukrainian infantry refused to rush into the fog of war. Instead, they expanded control layer by layer, securing the opened corridor to link with heavy backup elements. Listen. Frontline infantry didn't waste time. They immediately worked to widen that breach into a secure bridgehead. They locked down the routes they had just fought so hard to capture, pushed deep into adjacent tree lines, and secured the corridor, ensuring the follow-on assault elements wouldn't get chewed up in those exact same brutal kill zones. Look closely, because this is exactly where the broader tactical reality of this engagement hits home. Ukrainian command didn't deploy the M1 Abrams as some flashy propaganda piece for the cameras, but integrated it into a calculated kill chain. This assault started with drone recon, shifted to active disruption, baited Russian artillery, punched a secure corridor, shoved infantry forward, and locked down the entire sector before Moscow could even attempt a counterattack. The real takeaway from the Pokrovsk sector isn't just that heavy American armor hit the frontline dirt. It is the fact that this tank dominated because the battle space was fully primed beforehand. That is the hard tactical truth of this firefight. Russian forces didn't bleed territory over a single lucky cannon round. Their defensive lines cracked because Ukrainian troops layered their combat power. First-person view drones disrupted, artillery hammered strongpoints, and the Abrams forced immediate panic. When you and I analyze it like that, this engagement tells a much bigger story than just another Western tank hitting the mud. It proves how modern warfare is brutally rewriting the doctrine for every single weapons system. Heavy armor still matters, but the era of the lone armored spearhead is dead. It survives only as a node in a massive lethal network. That is the grim tactical warning flashing out of Pokrovsk today. We are going to track more vicious combined arms clashes along the urban outskirts, through shattered tree lines, and down exposed highways where any maneuver is spotted in seconds and destroyed with absolute precision. So the strategic debate is still raging in command centers. Does this footage confirm tanks still dominate the modern battlefield? Or does it prove that even a 60-ton beast survives only when it brings backup? If you want raw, unfiltered battlefield intelligence like this, hit the like button, share this debrief, and subscribe to Military Force for relentless coverage on frontline combat, real tactical breakdowns, and the shifting political dynamics driving modern war. Stay frosty.